Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Food Systems in Season. My name is Bill Lester, and I'm with University of Florida IFAS Extension Service in Hernando County, Florida. And today I have with me Morgan Pinkerton, who's with University of Florida Extension in Seminole County, and J.K. Yarborough, who is with University of Florida Extension housed in Orange County. JK, are you a multi-county agent or are you just with Orange County?
I am a multi-county agent. I cover both Orange County and Seminole County.
Okay, so you have a big area that you're responsible for.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and today we're going to be talking about bees and chickens, two things that I am not an expert on. So we did bring in some experts here. This is going to be really great for anybody who might be thinking about getting bees, getting chickens, raising but one or the other or both on your property. You want to get fresh eggs, you want to get honey. There's a number of things that you need to know and keep in mind before you just kind of dive right in and buy a beehive and get a whole flock of chickens and just put them in the backyard. You don't want to start that way. You want to know what you're doing. And these guys are going to go through that and help you with all the basics here. If any of you has a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box. We'll go ahead and wait till close to the end of the presentation to go through the questions so we can answer all of them at once. But feel free to throw in your questions, comments, say good morning. Let us know that you're on here live watching. Let us know that you're awake today. And we're more than happy to go through all those questions. So I just wanted to very quickly point out that today is January 28th, and we are talking about chickens and honeybees. And then next Friday is our last session for our winter group of classes. And we're just going to have an open Q&A session. We're going to try to get back all the different speakers from all the different classes, as many as we can, depending on people's schedules, to answer any questions, any follow-up, have kind of a group discussion, kind of a free-form little class where if you have any questions at all about what we've covered or anything else, bring your questions. We'll go through them. If we can't answer them, we'll find somebody who can, because we know a lot of people up in Gainesville, University of Florida, and they know pretty much everything. So let's go ahead and start with bees and chickens. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn myself off here and let you guys kind of go for it.
Well, thank you, Bill, for turning it over to us. And I guess we just wanted to start with kind of connecting these two topics. Why are bees and chickens on the same day? And if anyone knows the reason for this, you can go ahead and put that into the chat. And I'll give it a few seconds here just in case we have people live who are thinking about this or thinking about putting something into the chat box. What do bees and chickens have in common? You might think of a couple things, but one of the things that we are connecting bees and chickens together with today is that they are both livestock. So this is something that you can keep and manage, and we'll talk a little bit about the management of the two of these today. And we're going to start off with talking about bees. For those of you who don't know, there are a lot of bees out there, though many of us are very familiar with the honeybee, and that's oftentimes what people are managing in their hives. There are over 4,000 species of bees in the United States alone, and 315 of those species are in Florida. So that's quite a lot of bees. So I see some people are communicating in the chat there too, finally. Glad to see you. Glad to have you communicating and talking with us. And so we have a lot of bees here in Florida, though, like I said, when we're talking about managing a hive, a lot of times we're thinking about that honeybee, the European honeybee, especially Apis mellifera. Why do we care so much about those bees? Well, they offer a lot of really cool pollination services. So they are one of our major pollinators, though there's a lot of other pollinators out there. It's not just bees, there's other insects, even some birds, bats, and other creatures too. But those pollination services are very important for us just our natural lands alone, as well as agriculture. So J.K. and I both work a lot in our agricultural communities locally here in Central Florida. So that's why we care a lot about bees, because those pollination services are very important for a lot of our crops. So some of those major pollinator needing crops are going to be our almonds, avocados, apple, apricot, and even some more. Here in Florida, blueberries, strawberries, watermelon, and a lot of our cucurbits really need a lot of pollination. And bees are very important for that. So important, you can see pictured here that this is actually almond trees, and we're getting about to the time of almond pollination for the year over in the West Coast, California area, where beekeepers will travel across the entire United States to bring their bees to help in the pollination of these almonds. It's a huge process. It needs a lot of pollination, so that's why we're bringing in a lot of bees. So early February is around the time where we start to see people migrating out west with their bees for pollination. Another reason we care about bees is many of you may like honey. I know I do. I love putting honey in my food that I'm cooking. I like it in tea and other drinks. And so beekeepers are also keeping bees specifically for honey production. Some of the reasons that we care so much about keeping beehives. And yeah. So just bringing some context a little bit into what we're talking about today. So we have a video prepared for you where we are going to be going inside one of our local beehives. And we didn't do this live because this time of the year, the bees are kind of quiet. There's not a whole lot going on in the beehive. It's the winter season for the bees, so there's not as many flowers out. They're not doing quite as much pollination as they would be in the summer and spring. But right now we do have some flowers in Central Florida. You'll see like maple, sand pine, wild mustards. Willow is going to be flowering around this time of the year. So the bees might be out and about going to that, but they are definitely a lot quieter than other parts of the year. So I guess, Bill, we can go ahead and start with that video, and then we have some tools of the trade that we're going to be talking about, and I brought that with us to share today too.
In this virtual field trip, we are going to take a trip inside the hive with Dennis the Bee Guy, one of our local beekeepers and owner of Black Hammock Bee Farms.
So right now we are in a blueberry orchard, and so our bees have been brought in a little early this year, and so they're here to pollinate the blueberries, and so their goal will be to go out and touch the flowers and move pollen around and help the flowers to set more fruit.
Pollination starts with the flower. There are female flowers, male flowers, or flowers that have both female and male parts. Male flowers, or the male part, produces pollen, and female flowers, or that female part, have ovaries that need fertilization from a male flower. Pollination is the movement of the pollen from that male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, and after pollination, a flower is considered fertilized. It can then develop into a fruit or vegetable like we see with many of our crops. Pollination can occur in many different ways. Sometimes this happens by wind blowing that pollen around. This is how pollen ends up all over our car during the spring. However, sometimes the plants need help getting that pollen from the male part of the flower to the female parts of the flower. That is where our pollinators come in, and a pollinator is just assisting in the movement of that pollen. The honeybee is one of the world's most widely recognized pollinators, but there are other pollinators out there like other bees, butterflies, flies, insects, birds, bats, and many other creatures.
Once a bee goes to a certain type of flower, that's the only flower she'll be interested in during her lifetime. So she'll move pollen from that type of flower to another flower exactly of the same type. And so that'll help the farmers to increase yields.
Today, these bees are out in a blueberry farm doing that job of pollination.
So what we're doing is just a typical hive inspection. We're going to look inside and just check the health of the bees and see the progress as far as springtime development. And one thing I always like to point out too is, a lot of times people think bees are defensive. So notice we're not, overly protected here. The bees are being very calm. They're not trying to get to us. So we can see that they're happy and relaxed. So smoke is used to keep the bees calm. And so bees communicate through a pheromone. We kind of look at it like a smell. So smoke is a pungent odor. It's much louder than the smell the bees use to communicate. So by introducing smoke, the bees are not able to communicate to defend the colony.
Here we are pulling out the frames of the hive. You will notice this guy right here is actually a drone. It's a male bee. The drones are a little bit bigger than the female workers, and their eyes touch at the top. Drones do not have a stinger like female worker bees, so their abdomen is thick and rounded at the end. Their only job is to pass on the colony's genes by mating with queens outside from other colonies. When drones are present in the beehive, that means the colony is thinking of reproducing.
This looks like the Kix cereal. See how the cells look different, how they're bulbous, as opposed to the ones over here are flat. So this is the female brood. So this will be the new female bees that will be born. And this area consists of the male bees that are about to be born.
Worker honeybees are female. They are smaller than the drones, and they have specialized structures for collecting pollen and nectar. The workers generally do not reproduce, though they are capable of laying unfertilized eggs that can develop into drones. This typically only happens when the queen isn't healthy, has died, or left the hive. The workers do a lot for the hive, including brood care, foraging, honey production, hive maintenance, and hive defense tasks. Unlike the male drones, they do have a stinger. Rather than specializing in only one job, each worker progresses through these tasks in a predictable order based on their age. Honeybee queens are the reproductive female of the hive. The queen has a longer and plumper abdomen than the drones and workers, as you can see here. Many beekeepers will mark their queens with colored paint to make her easier to find and to keep track of her age. Throughout most of the colony's life, the queen is responsible for producing all of the offspring for the hive. Early in the queen's life, she went on a mating flight and mated with drones from other colonies before she returned to start her own colony.
So this is the evidence that we have a really healthy queen, and she's capable of laying what we call a very compact pattern. So she's come across and laid eggs across this entire area all at one time. So these bees are all going to hatch out at roughly the same time.
You're probably well familiar with what honeycomb looks like. It has a distinct pattern of hexagonal cells. Honeycomb is made from beeswax, a substance created by worker bees. They secrete this wax from special glands in their body. Then they chew the wax to soften it and build the hexagonal cells. And these cells have a lot of purposes, from pollen and honey storage to raising new bees. We can also harvest the wax for other purposes like making candles, lip balms, and more. Bees need to eat just like we do. They need protein, carbohydrates, nutrients, and fats in their diet, and of course water. Bees will collect nectar and pollen from the flowers they visit. That pollen specifically contains protein.
This one right here has got a whole bunch of pollen on her. Look at that one. Wow, that was awesome. There's another one right there. They have baskets on their legs, and they put the pollen on those baskets. And then they come back and kick them off.
In the springtime, the hive can look extra colorful, especially here in Florida. The different colors are from different pollen sources. Certain plants have pollen ranging from orange, yellow, red, white, green, and more. Nectar is a sweet substance full of carbohydrates. It also has important minerals and nutrients that the bees need to survive. In the hive, honeybees process nectar and turn it into honey so that it can be stored in the hive as a food source. This is especially important in the wintertime when there aren't a lot of flowers around. Just like the bees, many people find honey tasty too. So in addition to those pollination services, honeybees are raised to produce honey. And that's also why we consider them livestock.
See how many bees there are on each frame here? This is all honey. Again, there's a little bit of pollen here. Here is all pollen.
Oh, wait, hold on.
And you can see that's mostly yellow pollen. And then this area here is all what we call capped honey. So once the bees have reduced the moisture content down to approximately 18%, they'll put a waxy capping over it. And that'll let us know at that point that it's honey based on the moisture content, and we can then take it from the bees. here again, an entire frame full of just capped honey and a little tiny bit of pollen down here on the corner. Beautiful.
For more information on local agriculture, beekeeping, and other related topics, please reach out to your local county extension office.
So that took us a little bit on a trip inside the hive to get you up close and personal about what you would see if you were going in the hive yourself. And like I said, this time of the year, the bees are a little bit quieter than what we saw in this video. Around this time, this is when they're just kind of hanging out. You might need to feed those colonies too, because like we talked about already, there might not be as many flower sources out in the environment. And I see that someone had said, are the bees using honey to survive the cold? So during this time, like we talked about, the flowers aren't there. At least there's fewer flowers around for the bees to visit and bring back nectar and pollen. So you might have to supplement feeding the hives during this time of the year. And I brought with me today an example of one of those feeders that you might be using. So this is an entrance feeder that could be used specifically for feeding those bees. You might put sugar water in here, and you can see the top of this has little holes in it, so the bees are going to be able to get that sugar water out of this container. And this just attaches on to the base of the hive, and they're able to get that. There's other feeders out there. So there might be some bucket feeders. I don't have an example of that one today, sometimes called a pail feeder. Those are often used by the commercial guys or people with multiple hives. And there's top feeders, pro feeders, and a couple others. But I just wanted to give an example of that one, since around this time of the year, you might be supplementing some sugar water to the hive and potentially buying pollen to supplement as well. So they sell pollen bricks. And feel free to chime in at any point, JK, if you have anything to add here too. JK does a lot of our intro to beekeeping programs. Some of the other basic equipment that I have here, just to kind of go over what you would use if you are a beekeeper. This is one of the common ones, a Hive Tool here. This is a very standard Hive Tool. There are some different forms of the Hive Tool that you might see, but a lot of our beekeepers do use this one or something very similar. And what else do I have here today? You saw this in the video already. This is a smoker. Let's see if everyone can see this here. So this is one of our larger smokers. What you would do with this one is you're going to be putting something inside to burn. So at our office, we oftentimes are using something like dry pine needles or dry leaves, leaf litter to put in here. So we're putting that in there, and it's going to be burning in there. Our smoke's coming out of here. This helps to keep the fire inside oxygenated, keep it going, and to help force that smoke out. Especially when we're first going into the hive, we're using that. And if the bees are starting to get annoyed with us being in there at all, we might give them another puff or two of smoke to keep them calm. Like Dennis mentioned in the video, that's just kind of blocking them from communicating with each other. So they aren't warning each other that something's wrong, someone's in the hive. It's just keeping them calm in the meantime. We saw some of our frames, though in the video, these frames did have bees on them. This is a frame with a foundation inside of it. So the bees can build directly on this foundation that's in the shape of that hexagonal shape that we were talking about. And you can see that here. Looks like my background's trying to block out a little bit of it. But you can also get these hives as just a foundationless frame where they don't have this inside of it. And the bees build their own structure on there. And of course, the tool I have on that's very important for our beekeepers is some kind of bee suit. The important part is keeping your face protected. Some beekeepers prefer just to wear a veil of some kind, but others prefer a little bit more protection, like long sleeves here. Sometimes wearing gloves. I know I oftentimes wear gloves going into the hive, though more experienced beekeepers might be not wearing gloves, or they might be accustomed to being stung or managing the bees. The bees can potentially sting you when you are managing the hive, and that's that female worker bee that would do that. They're defending the hive. So when they're upset, they could sting you. That's why we have this kind of protective equipment to make sure that we're safe when we are managing our hives. And then the last thing I have to share today is just a queen catcher. So at probably around March, so in about a month or so, is when the bees start to ramp up for the spring. And when that happens, the colony is going to start to grow. And it eventually may outgrow the container you have them in, so the hive boxes that you're using. And that's also following in line with spring. The flowers are out there. There's lots of flowers for the bees to visit, bringing back nectar and pollen to the hive. And so honey production is going to ramp up in the spring as well. So like I said, those hives might start to get bigger, and your hive might try to split. And what will happen with that is you will see queen cups or queen cells in the hive, which we didn't see that in the video because that was a hive that wasn't on the verge of splitting, or it's well managed to prevent that split from happening. But you may have to catch your queen when this happens. And you're also, when you're first putting a queen in your hive, you're going to be catching her to mark her. This is helpful in that it allows you to mark the queen while she's held and in a safe spot, so you don't hurt her in the process. There's a couple different kinds. This is more of our plunger style here. And this is one of our one-hand ones, though I have pretty small hands and have a hard time using this with one hand. Some people might find this one useful, but same style where you're trapping her, and then you can then go in through here and mark her with one of our marking markers, and you mark based on the color of the year to keep track of her age too. And we saw in the video one of our marked queens and what that would look like. You might also be using this tool specifically to catch your queen if your hive does split, to catch the new queen and clip her wings so that she doesn't fly away and split in the future. So that's just kind of a short overview of some of the tools we would be using in the hive. You got to see the inside of a hive there. And posted into the chat box in the comments are a beekeeping calendar, so you can have a little bit more information on what's going on in the hive if you do choose to manage your own hives. But if you don't and you just really like bees, there are other ways you can help protect bees. So if you have a garden or landscape area, plant pollinator-friendly plants. So things that are flowering at different times of the year. So there are flowers throughout the year and not just during certain seasons. And limit your use of pesticides in that area, because our pollinators, our bees, are insects. They can be affected by some of the insecticides that we use in the landscape and garden. There's also ways to create bee habitats. You can see that pictured here, which is great for some of our native bees, and our ground-dwelling bees like these a lot too. And like I said, if you're interested in becoming a beekeeper, there is a lot more to it than what we showed today. It is not as easy as you might think. There is still a lot of work that goes into it. And then you can also buy local honey and related products. So whether that's honeycomb, honey, or other products that our beekeepers are selling. So lots of great ways to support local beekeepers, support our pollinators. And here's just a few of the options you have. For those of you who are really interested in beekeeping, we have more classes available specifically for that. So J.K. does a great job teaching these Beekeeping 101, Beekeeping 201 classes, and a lab section of that, where you're actually out there in the hive, getting some hands-on practice for those beginner beekeepers. And you can either scan the QR code here in the top or visit our Orange County Extension Office Eventbrite for signing up for those classes. And they're coming up soon, February 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So it's great timing to have this class today.
All right. Now it's my portion to talk a little bit about chickens, but real quick, I will kind of chime in on the question about honeybees and are the bees using the honey to survive the cold? So individual honeybees are actually what we think of as cold-blooded, that they can't produce their own heat source. They rely on friction or the sun being nice and warm, other things like that to be able to warm themselves up. But when we think about the honeybee colony itself, it's actually viewed as a exothermic or warm-blooded creature because the colony itself, the group of bees, can actually regulate its own temperature. So in these temperatures that we got coming up tonight and tomorrow night, when it's really going to be really cold here in Florida, what honeybees will do is they'll cluster around together each other inside of their hive, and they'll vibrate their wings back and forth. And they'll eat quite a bit of honey or whatever nectar source they have, or sugar water, whatever you're supplementing them with. They'll eat that to give them some energy to be able to provide them to be able to shake around, move their wings, vibrate, to create friction to actually warm themselves inside of the hive. So in these cold temperatures that we got coming up, the honey doesn't directly keep them warm, but it provides them the energy to be able to move around and cause some friction to keep themselves warm. So a little bit of a roundabout way of saying it, but yeah. All right, so moving on to a little bit about backyard chickens. So well, I have a slide here talking about some of the reasons why you might want to get backyard chickens. Backyard chickens became kind of a popular thing it kind of started back in 2012, more or less, but it's kind of been ramping up. It has its moments of, peak interest and decrease. So just before the pandemic, it was kind of starting to not be as popular, but then when the pandemic started and then everybody decided they needed to get backyard chickens and everything like that, it really picked up interest once again. And so I have a couple of reasons as to why you may want to get chickens and some reasons why you might not want to get chickens. And so some reasons why you may want to get chickens is it can provide a nutritious food source, which is usually for eggs only. So when I teach this class on backyard chickens, it's usually referring to backyard chickens in an urban setting. So a lot of our urban areas are passing backyard chicken ordinances to allow people to have chickens in their backyard. And when it comes to outside of residential areas, sometimes some of the ordinances and things like that don't apply. But whenever I teach the class, we're talking about basic chicken caring or care for chickens. So that applies to anybody and everybody. So when it says nutritious food, eggs only, that's usually in our backyard chicken ordinances. They state that you can't harvest the bird for meat product on your premises. So you have to take it to a area that is certified to be allowed for that sort of harvesting. So again, usually it's a nutritious food source, but only for eggs. It can be a relaxing activity, entertaining to watch the birds as they do their daily routines. I have bug reduction, which oftentimes we'll get into the not reasons, but people sometimes think that getting chickens will remove pests from their gardens and things like that. And that's just not the reality of the situation. Biology and food education. It's a great way, especially when we're dealing with youth in our community and within our families, be able to teach them about the way biology works and of how, where their food comes from. Chickens provide a really good and compact way of providing that sort of education. Provoke friendly neighbors with an egg share, can provide that bridge between urban and rural communities, and their waste product is a really good source for green compost. So if you're into composting and you need some additional green sources, chicken waste is a really good source for that. And then on the right-hand side, I do have a column on reasons why you should not get chickens, because when I teach this class, I'm educating people onto the realities of having backyard chickens, and the realities are not always rainbows and sunshines. Sometimes there's some issues with having backyard chickens. And so oftentimes people get backyard chickens and they think, oh, well, I'll just get so much free eggs and it'll reduce my, grocery bill by so much. I can tell you that if you get backyard chickens, they will be the most expensive free eggs that you have ever had. because you have to provide feed and a coop and everything else for these birds, and those expenses add up. And so keeping backyard chickens is more of a hobby than anything. And because the better you feed these birds, the more productive they're going to be. And economies of scale just make it so that whenever you have, your small little backyard flock, those eggs are going to be pretty expensive when it comes down to it. Remove pests from your garden. I hear it all the time about people who get chickens and they put them in their garden in an effort to try to reduce the bugs or caterpillars in their garden, and the chickens just end up eating all their garden. Any sprouts and all their tomato plants, they just end up eating everything. So chickens can be really, problematic in that area. You only make that mistake once, really. Then chickens are so cute. Our chicks are so cute, and that's true. But those chicks are going to grow up and become chickens. And if you don't have the proper background or breeding on that bird, it could possibly grow up to be a rooster. And in all of our backyard chicken ordinances within residential areas, you're not allowed to have roosters. So that cute little trick that you've grown attached to, you might have to part ways with, as it turns out, because it turns out to be a rooster. And so there's a couple of reasons why you may want to not have chickens. So keep that in mind whenever you go to try to make these decisions on whether or not you want to get backyard chickens. Whenever we get our backyard birds, we're going to have to think about a couple of things, and we're going to talk about feeding, watering, and a little bit about coops as well. We're going to start off with feeding. So birds, they're avian. They have a little bit different digestive system than us. They do have a modified, it's what's called a modified monogastric system, meaning they have more or less one stomach, but they do their digestion a little bit different than what we do. So when it comes to feeding, chickens love to scratch and toss their feed all around if they can. It's just kind of in their behavior. They like to scratch things up to try to find different sources of food, newer food, fresher food, maybe a bug underneath. It's just kind of wired into them. So when we have our backyard systems, that feed that gets possibly scattered all around could be really messy and could get rotten. And if it gets wet, and then it could attract other bugs and possibly some rats. And that just becomes an issue that we really don't want to have to deal with. So ideally what we want to do is, however we feed these birds, we want to try to suspend it in the air. That way you're less likely to have pests getting access to that feed. So for instance, in the bottom right picture, you can see that those feeders are on a block for the birds to be able to access to. Well, rats could also climb up that block and just get right into the feed. So in an effort to try to prevent that from kind of happening, you can suspend or hang your feeder up off the ground. So for instance, in that top picture, you can see there's a handle hanging off of it. You could tie a rope around that and suspend it from the top of your coop or from a tripod or something like that to be able to get it up off of the ground. There's a couple of different ways that we can feed our birds. The hanging gravity fed system, like the top right picture, is what is pretty common. And I have a kind of an example of a smaller scale one here. This is one that will probably be commonly found inside of a brooder, which is where we raise our chicks. And the gravity fed system, the way it operates is we take off our container and we just fill it up with feed, and then we reattach it. And then the gravity allows the feed to just fall down into this tray. And in this tray, you can see that it has holes cut all around the side of it. And that way the birds can get in there and peck the feed up and eat it as they gain access to it. Now you can see this one has little holes cut around the side. That way the birds don't have direct access to the feed. That way they're less likely to get in there and scratch and throw it around. And that works pretty good. This one, again, is mostly for a brooder, for a small pen for chicks possibly, because it doesn't have that hanging style system like we do in our other one in our picture. And so that's our gravity fed system. It works pretty good. You can hang it up off the ground to reduce spillage and spoilage. However, there is still probably going to be some spillage associated with it. So you can see on that top right picture, it doesn't have those holes cut out, so the birds can kind of just scratch in there and sling it around. Another way that I've seen people doing recently that I like a pretty good bit is a feeding bucket style system. And that's that picture on the bottom right there. So it also is able to, you can lift it up off the ground possibly with a handle so you can reduce spillage. But this one also has only small ports or holes inside of a bucket that allows the birds to put their heads in to be able to access the feed. But that way they can't get their feet in there to scratch it around. They can't, it doesn't get wet on the inside. It's just a really good contained system for feeding the birds. And so it not only gets it up off of the ground to reduce pest problems, but also keeps the feed contained to reduce moisture from getting inside. And so that bottom picture to the right, you can see there's some square buckets that have, again, those little ports or holes in the side. You can even see the chickens have their heads in there actually pecking at them right now. You can buy boxes like that one that are already built, but you can also make your own, usually just getting a 5-gallon bucket and then finding some proper sized PVC pipes and drilling in the holes and then inserting those PVC pipes. There's many different videos on there or out there about that. So you can make your own with feeder bucket that way as well. And it's a really great way of containing feed within the coop. All right. I think our next topic is going to be about watering our birds, because if we're going to feed them, we got to be able to water them. And water is often overlooked as a supplement or as a nutrient in all of our livestock systems, but it's actually the most important nutrient. So it shouldn't be overlooked at all because it's the most important. So when it comes to water, there are many different ways to water our chickens. There's a gravity-fed bell-style system. So kind of like our feeder, except for if you take out the feed and put in water, that's kind of the way the gravity-fed bell style. So I got an example of our gravity-fed bell style system here. It is pretty much, again, like a lot like our feeder. And then that, let me untwist it here. You take the container, you fill it up full of water, and then when you're ready, you attach the top or the bottom plate, and it just sinks down. And when you invert it, then the water will rush down to the trays at the bottom, and the trays will just fill with water up to the lip, and then they'll stop unless the birds drink more, and then in which case it'll replenish it from the water that's on top. This works pretty good for providing water to a lot of birds. But as you can imagine, because it's open and access like this, the birds are going to splash around, try to get the water in there. They're going to scratch around, throw a lot of dirt in there. So you're probably, if you use this to water your chickens with, you're probably going to be using this or cleaning this probably every other day, if not every day, because they're just going to get, chickens are going to just sling feed in there and dirt, and it's just going to get kind of gross down in there. You can prevent that by, again, raising it up off the ground if possible. But with water, water starts to weigh a little bit more. So we have to think about, how we're raising it up off the ground and get a little bit more structurally sound way of hanging it. So getting it up off the ground will help with the spillage and spoilage when it comes to water. But we have some other ways that we can also water our birds, make it a little bit more efficient. So one of the ways is we have a dish style system. So if you could imagine this little dish that I have here has a black attachment piece right here that you can screw into a PVC pipe filled with water. And there's two different configurations. You can put it, in the vertical position like this, or it actually detaches like so, and you can actually mount it horizontally. Now in this dish, if you can imagine this was attached to a PVC pipe full of water, the water is going to be on this end, and then you're going to need to put a little bit of water inside your dish. And the way the water gets inside of the dish is actually we have a little toggle, and that little yellow toggle there, whenever it gets pushed aside, allows the water from being gravity fed to be flow into the dish. So whenever our bird comes over, they're feeling thirsty, they're going to take a drink, put their beak down inside of this dish, they're going to push aside the toggle, and they're going to drink their water. And as they push aside the toggle, it's going to replenish with water from the PVC pipe. Now, one thing that I've seen, a negative comment about this that I've seen, is that birds like to drink after they are done with a meal. So after they get done eating, much like us. So when they do that, their beaks usually have some sort of food residue on them. So when they come over here to the dish, that food residue will often wash off inside of our dish or our cup here. And when that happens, over time, we'll have some food residue build up and build up and build up at the bottom of our dish. And if we don't do a good job of cleaning that out, it will eventually build up enough to where it is pushing this toggle active constantly. And then the water is going to just continue to flow inside of the dish. And then eventually, however you have your water system hooked up, for instance, to a rain barrel, or maybe to a spigot, or to a larger PVC bucket, or to a 5-gallon bucket on top, it's going to run out of the water real quick. And then if you're not checking your water constantly, you could possibly have some dehydration issues going on inside your flock. So there's another style of cup that I have in the picture of on the presentation. That style of cup, actually, the cup right in the middle has that nice big red dish. That one actually works off of gravity. So the toggle for that one is actually on the inside of the mechanism. And whenever the water flows into that dish, it starts to weigh a little bit more. And the dish will actually start to, it's on a spring, and it'll actually start to bend down. And as it bends down, it shuts off of that toggle so that it stops water flow. And as the birds come over, they can take their drink, get some water, and then thus the cup weighs a little bit less because there's less water in it. So the spring pulls it up. And then as it gets pulled up, it opens up the toggle. So more water can rush in, thus causing it to weigh more and causing the cup to fall back down, then closing the toggle. That's a pretty good way of feeding chickens as well. I've seen several of those. Just keep in mind that there can still be some food residue wash off in there. The only side effect is that the water won't be able to go into the cup anymore. So if you're not keeping an eye on those dishes to keep them nice and cleaned out, you could still lead to some dehydration issues. So just make sure you're keeping them nice and clean. Another way to water our chickens that I've seen is pretty popular is our nipple style systems. And so you can see a picture on the top right picture. We have a PVC pipe with some little red, hanging parts on it. And that's what I have right here is actually one of these vertical style water nipple systems. And so as you saw in the picture of the PVC, we have a PVC pipe that we actually just screw this inside. It screws up and sits right there like this. And we have a little toggle hanging down here. And with the water pressure on it, there's a ball bearing on the inside that's pushing. The water pressure will push the ball bearing closed so that water can't come out of the toggle. And then whenever the birds are feeling thirsty, they can come over along and they'll push up on this little hanging piece here. And whenever they push up on it, it pushes the ball bearing up, which allows water to flow down the bottom. So the chickens will push up, get their water, drink it, push up, and they'll just keep doing that to be able to get their water source. Now this one is a vertical style one, so you can only mount it in the vertical up and down position. If you have it sideways, the water pressure usually isn't going to be strong enough to push the ball bearing closed, and so it's just going to leak out constantly. Having said that, these ones will have some level of leakage with them constantly, just because the nature of the way it's designed, it doesn't seal all the way usually. So there's going to be some leakage that occurs with them to some extent. So depending on your operation and how tolerant you are of leaks, the vertical might not be the style for you, and you might prefer having a horizontal water nipple style, which in the presentation, that red cross style system, if you look at the picture to the bottom left, that's our horizontal one. It operates in the same mechanism pretty much as our vertical one. The only difference is that it's spring loaded, and so it has a spring that pushes the nipple closed, and that until the chicken comes over there and pecks at it, opens it up and lets a little bit of water drip out, and you can see there's a little bit of a tray on the front. They'll drink that water and then do it again and again to be able to provide themselves with water. This way your water source isn't getting dirty. That way you can constantly provide them with water. The new nipple styles are working pretty good. But so nipple style, cup style, a gravity fed bell, however it works for you, we just want to make sure we're giving our chickens some water. All right, so talk about housing real quick and chicken coops. Chicken coops can be pretty simple or they can be pretty complex. It's just a matter of, if you want, are you building it yourself? What do you want it to look like? Do you want it to look like your actual house and have a replica of your house for your birds? There's no limit to where the imagination is, but there are a couple of specifications, about 6 things that we like to see going on within our coop, regardless of its size, to make sure that we're going to provide a care for our chickens the best. So there's a couple of terminology things I'll just knock out of the way real quick. So I mentioned brooders earlier. So brooders are just kind of like a hamster cage that we keep chicks in to be able to make sure that we raise them properly and they get their best chance at life. Hen house is actually a structure you keep your birds in, but it's for birds only, as in that it doesn't have a large entrance for people to be able to just walk in. Chicken coop is usually large enough for humans to enter. A chicken run is the enclosed area outside of the coop for the chickens to be able to roam and do their thing. And then chicken tractors is a possibility. It's kind of like it's a chicken coop that doesn't have a bottom, that essentially is a movable chicken pen. We don't see these very common in our urban setting or in our backyard settings, because usually our ordinances require our chicken coop to be structured down or anchored down into a set spot. So being able to move it around isn't really a feasible option in our residential areas. So we don't really see the chicken tractor selection in our backyard urban settings. Housing should be clean, draft-free, and comfortable year-round. Chickens can be either cold or wet, but they do not do well being cold and wet. So keep that in mind whenever you build your coop. You want to make sure it's nice and tight, keeping the rain off of them, but has a little bit of airflow to make sure they don't get too stuffy in there. And the larger you build it, the more, you're going to have space. So that way there decreases the chances of flies, odors, and disease. But you do need to follow whatever your ordinances are. And that's the most important thing is, all of your backyard chicken ordinances are going to have some sort of building requirements or setback requirements and building maximum size build that you're allowed to build to. So keep in mind, whenever you do this, stick to your ordinance's requirements. And if you if you use wood, try to use pressure treated wood for any wood that's in contact with the ground, because here in Florida, our sandy soils will eat up any sources of carbon. And that's for sure going to be, any kind of wood. So make sure you use pressure treated wood. That way it just increases the longevity of your chicken coop. So here's a quick mock-up of a simple hen house that has those 5 or 6 things that I like to see inside of a coop. So first, we want to make sure we have a good sealed enclosure. And we'll talk about what we can use for that in a little bit. We want to have a nesting box, an area for those birds to be able to lay their eggs. We want to have a mesh floor / manure management. I mean, your birds are going to be pooping. So you need to make sure you know what you're going to be doing with all that manure and how you're going to handle it. We want to have a roost, give them a spot to be able to roost during the night, where a place for them to feel like they're safe and for a place for them to hold on to and go to sleep. And then make sure you have it as human accessible. So here, like I said, is a mock-up of a hen house. And if you recall, that's usually only big enough for the hens to get inside. Well, if you seal it up and make it so that only hens can get inside, if you get a sick bird that's going to, hang out in the corner of the hen house, how are you going to get access to her to be able to grab her to better take care of her? So keep that in mind if you're going to build something like a hen house. Try to make sure you add some sort of larger access panel or a wall that's on hinges. That way, although you might not use it very often, in the event that you do need to get in there, you still have access to be able to get inside of that structure. So the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be the nesting boxes. So as nesting boxes, provide one for every 2 to 3 hens. Well, we want to make them about 12 by 12 in size. They can be made out of wood, metal, or plastic. I've seen a couple of different variations. We can see in our top right picture, just a 5-gallon bucket with the lid been cut to give them an area to jump into. And it could be as simple as that. But you can also make it as intricate as having, outside access to it. So in that bottom right picture, you can see that actually is, you don't even have to go inside of your chicken coop or your hen house to get to your eggs. You can just go to a little, if you put your nesting boxes on the outside of the coop, that way you can just put a hinge top on it. That way you can just raise the hinge on the top, get down in there, get your eggs, close it up, lock it. You never have to step foot inside your coop to get your eggs. Another thing that I've seen people do with their nesting boxes, especially these exterior nesting boxes, they not only put a hinge top on it, but they also make that back wall hinged as well. That way, whenever it comes time to take out that bedding material, such as we have here, shredded newspaper, wood chips, or straw, when it comes time to clean that out, instead of having to reach down in there and scoop it out, if the back wall's on a hinge as well, you can just lay it down flat and you can just scrape it all out with your hands real quick, fold it back up, put in new material, close up, you're good to go. So for our nesting boxes, it's pretty simple. We just want to put some sort of bedding material in there. That way the chickens have a nice soft place to lay their eggs. And we want to make sure we have a landing board in the front. That way they can jump on and off of it. That way they can get easier access to that nesting box. So that pretty much covers nesting boxes. I think our next thing is going to be about roosts. So our roosts, usually we want to allow 8 to 9 inches of roost space per bird. You can space those roosts about 12 to 14 inches apart. You can see that in our bottom right picture, or our right side picture, that roost is actually going up at an angle. And oftentimes when you see roosts inside of a coop, they're built at an angle. You don't necessarily have to put them at an angle. It's just usually more space efficient because we're using less room if we just built it at a horizontal angle, or at a horizontal. So when we put them at an angle like that, it just allows for a little bit more room inside of the coop to be able to be moved around. So you can put them at an angle if you'd like. Use 1.5 inch dowel rods or 2x2 pieces of lumber, and just to make your roost work very well. And try not to have the roost too close to your nesting box. You can see on our right side picture, we have them at opposite sides of the coop. The reason for that is we don't want our birds to actually roost or go to sleep inside of our nesting boxes, because they're going to defecate and poop and make a lot of mess inside of there. And so we want to try to have them at opposite ends to try to encourage them to roost on the roosts and just lay eggs in our nesting box. And then in our middle picture there, you can see that underneath those chickens, so that's their roost that they're on, underneath there, we can see that that's the mesh floor system that I was kind of talking about earlier. So just keep in mind that whatever you put underneath your roost, there's going to be a lot of poop going on there because that's where the birds spend their nights and they got to poop. So they're going to do it right there. So if you put a mesh wire system underneath it, all that poop's going to drop down, and you could have either a removable tray there, or you can put some bedding material there to actually compost and get some of that waste material already kind of composted right there. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. Just keep in mind that the roost area underneath the roost area is probably where you're going to be getting a lot of poop. So just have something in mind of how you're going to deal with it. I also mentioned we need to build it nice and secure. So when it comes to secure coops, we want to make sure we're building it to building with the proper material. There's only three materials that I recommend building a chicken coop with: woven wire, hardware cloth, or welded wire. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories of people saying, "Oh yeah, I had chickens and I built it nice and cute, and then a raccoon got in there and killed them all." And I'll say, "Oh really? Well, how'd you build your coop? Did you build it with chicken wire?" And they say, "Oh yeah, I built it with chicken wire, and that raccoon got right through it." And I say, "Yep, there's a reason why we call it chicken wire. It's really good at working and keeping in chickens. It's not called raccoon wire because it does nothing to stop raccoons. They'll get right through it, no problem." So build your coops with either woven wire, hardware cloth, or welded wire, and make sure you latch them up at night. That way nothing can get inside there. And whenever you're putting in the wire on the outside, if you possibly can, you can kind of see of our bottom right picture, you want to pick that wire and bury it in the ground as well if possible. That way any of our digging predators can't burrow underneath and get up inside of the coop. That way they'll just run into more wire. And I think that wraps up my portion about chickens. Should I go ahead and try to answer some questions, or?
Sure. Here, let me go ahead, and we did get a question from PJ, and she says that her daughter is free-ranging various birds.
Mm-hmm.
She feeds them from feeders, and then other critters are trying to get to her chickens, ducks, and turkeys, whether it be for the birds or to get to the feed. So any other advice you can give somebody to keep predators and other animals out or away from them?
Okay, so there's a couple of things we got going on here. We're using the free range system, which means we're just letting the birds outside, outside to range in a pasture or in a backyard in an area at their own will. That is just inherently going to increase the predation upon your birds. There's just some things that you cannot prevent. You're just inducing that risk to them. You can't avoid it. So some things that we can do to try to prevent that is if we know what area they're going to be in, if what we're losing a lot of our chickens to are birds of prey, such as hawks, what we can do is we can put up other prey species. So sometimes we'll put up fake owls to try to prevent other species from coming in there. Another one to do is to hang a lot of CDs. So I don't know if you're like me, I got a lot of CDs that I don't need anymore because everything's digital. If you can hang some CDs from some limbs and things like that, the reflective nature of the CDs as they spin around in the wind will, catch the eye of birds, and they'll kind of, stay away from that. Also keep in mind, if you're keeping several species like that together, you're also increasing the possibility of disease risk, especially if you're dealing with turkeys and chickens. So there's a disease out there called blackhead disease, and chickens can harbor that disease and not really be affected by it. But because they're harboring that disease, they can spread it on to other species. And turkeys are quite susceptible to blackhead disease. So often when we're dealing with several species together, PJ, if you can possibly, I would encourage you to try to keep at least the turkeys separate from everything else, because it's just you're eventually going to run into some blackhead disease issues there. Now, if you're dealing with rodents and other things in your feed, I would ask, are you using the bucket feeder system? Because that's just a really great way of making all that feed contained into one area. And if possible, then trying to set like a TP style system, get some T-posts or some wooden posts and make a TP to hang that bucket from. That way there's less likely, that way the other pests have to really work to be able to get into that feed source.
Okay, and PJ also says she's so glad she's here today. Well, PJ, we're glad you're here today also. And Shalane says, great info today. Thank you. You're very welcome. And Everyday Evangelism says, thanks for this information and sharing with us. You are very welcome. We'd like to remind everybody that we'll be back here again next Friday morning at 10 a.m. for our open Q&A session, and hopefully Morgan and JK will be able to at least stop by and be here for a little part of the time. And PJ is going to share this video with her daughter and her family. If you're watching us live, this live session will be saved on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to go back and watch it over and over again, take notes, write down details. So keep that in mind. And let me go ahead and show Morgan's email if you have any other questions about bees, beekeeping, commercial agriculture, anything. We're here to help and answer your questions. So there's Morgan's email address, and there's JK's also. So if anybody has any last minute questions, if you want to go ahead and get them in the chat really, really quick, we'll be able to squeeze them in today. Otherwise, let me ask one real quick question. JK, if somebody's interested in getting chickens, who do they need to check with their local government, depending on what county they live in, to make sure it's okay and they're not going to be breaking any laws or ordinances?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that all breaks down to where are you residing, the municipality in which you reside. So for instance, the city of Orlando has a chicken ordinance passed, and before last year, Orange County didn't have one. So people who live within city limits of Orlando were allowed to have backyard chickens, but other people who lived in unincorporated Orange County were not. Orange County has since then passed an ordinance to allow for backyard chickens. So it all matters, what municipality you actually reside in, your address resides in. I usually tell people who's picking up your trash. Think about who's picking up your trash. Is it the city? Is it the county? Usually that's going to give an indication as to what your municipality is. Once you know where you're living at, I recommend there's a website called Municode.com, and I'll see if I can't send that to you real quick. And that website actually keeps a updated list of a lot of the ordinances around the entire nation. Let me see. Yeah, that's right. They keep an updated list for the entire nation, and you can go to that website. You can check out your area's ordinances. You can just do a quick search of chickens or poultry, and if there's a backyard chicken ordinance passed, usually in the search it will pop up, and you'll be able to read your ordinance as such. If one doesn't pop up, that generally is a suggestion that you don't have one passed for your area, in which case the best thing you can do is contact your board of county commissioners or your city commissioners, however it's structured, to let them know that, hey, I'm interested in a backyard chicken ordinance being passed in our area. And chances are you're not alone. So a lot of these other people who are interested use social media to connect with each other to try to make a louder voice, to let their elected officials know, hey, we would like to have a backyard chicken ordinance passed. And so it's just a matter of contacting your elected officials.
Yeah, because I know it's very popular, as is keeping bees. So Morgan, before somebody gets bees, they go out and buy a beehive and stick it in their backyard and surprise their neighbors with it. Who should they check with to make sure that it's okay?
It's kind of along the same lines. There's going to be some hoops to go through to make sure you're good too. For keeping bees too, you are going to have to go through FDAC's hive inspections. So that's another important thing, but it depends on, I believe, your homeowners association. If you live in one of those, they might have restrictions on being able to keep bees. It might even be in your, the property has some in the documents on the property. The deed, for example, might say something regarding bees, and JK can chime in a little bit more on this because he has a lot of good knowledge on that.
Yeah, so beekeeping is actually regulated by the state government. So like Morgan said, your HOA does have precedence over that. So if your HOA forbids it, it's forbidden. But other than that, it's down to the state government, and the state government essentially says, have at it. If you have land that is needed for beekeeping, you can do it. Now, there are going to be, like Morgan said, some stipulations that you have to follow if you live on non-agricultural zone land. But pretty much if you have less than a quarter of an acre, you're allowed to keep up to 3 colonies. Yep. Now, you are registered to become, or you are required to become a registered beekeeper with, like Morgan said, FDACS, which is the Florida Department of Ag Consumer Services, so the state ag department. you do need to become registered. And then there's a few stipulations that you have to follow. Pretty much, they're just good practices that you would do regardless of what, if you had to follow them or not, like keeping a water source for them, making sure you're checking them at least once a month, making sure you do your best to prevent swarms, things like that are real simple that you'd probably do anyway. They just want to make sure that you're going to follow those things. So when it comes to beekeeping, you know, like I said, the city or the county, they can't regulate whether or not you can. It's all a matter of the state, and the state usually says, have at it.
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, and with PJ's string of emojis there, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. And hopefully all of you will be back here again next Friday morning at 10 a.m. And to our guest speakers, Morgan, J.K., thank you so much for joining us today. I think that was very, very interesting and really great.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
okay, thanks, everybody. We'll see you again next week.